You are tuned to 90.3 WXBC in Newton. And a taste of what you'll hear this coming National Day of Mourning that some people still call Thanksgiving. And I'll be playing all Native American and or Native American influence music. Rock, folk, new age, experimental chants, and spoken word. And I'll be speaking with folks who've come back from the protests at Plymouth, which are still going on. And in a moment, we will talk to Andrew Cameron Bailey and Connie Baxter Marlow. And we're going to talk about the first Thanksgiving. And they are authors of the book, The Trust Frequency, and a film called In Search of the Future, What Do the Wise Ones Know? So stay tuned for that. Okay, you were tuned to 90.3 WXBC in Newton. And this is Victor Robert Venckus with you, and this is the Expanding Awareness portion of Saturday morning programming, on which I often do conduct live interviews regarding the paranormal. I might feature holistic health, and from time to time we cover animal rights and progressive ideas and such. And with us online is Andrew Cameron Bailey and Connie Baxter Marlow. And they are authors and filmmakers, and they present their ideas on conscious, loving, interconnected, abundant nature of the universe with a synthesis of indigenous cosmology, quantum science, and Eastern and Western mysticism. And they have a book called The Trust Frequency, 10 Assumptions for a New Paradigm. And they also have a film, In Search of the Future, What Do the Wise Ones Know? And their current book, film, screenplay project called The First 50 Years, Freedom and Friendship at Plymouth Plantation. And they bring honor to the Pilgrims and the Pokanoket Wampanoag Indians for their role in the evolution of democracy and the American mind and spirit. Good morning, folks.
Hi, Victor. How are you today?
Okay, I'm doing fairly well.
Good. Victor, I should say hello as well. It's good to be with you again.
Okay, Andrew, good to have you all back. All right, what do we absolutely know about the first Thanksgiving? And is there any written document of that time, of that date, going back to 1621?
All right, so there is a very definite historical event that occurred sometime in the fall of 1621, at the end of the Mayflower Pilgrims, so-called, at the end of their first year in Plymouth, what became Plymouth Colony, during which time they had met in the spring. They had met the Pokanoket Indians, headed by a man we generally know as Massasoit. Now, that sounds like that was actually a title rather than his name, but anyway, most people call him Massasoit. And at their first meeting, they crafted a treaty, and they honored this treaty perfectly all of that year and had a successful harvest. Now, that treaty also happened to go on for another half century, 54 years before that treaty was broken. It's one of the most extraordinary events, perhaps in human history. You do not find many examples of treaties, especially treaties between Europeans and Native Americans, most of which were broken by the Europeans. This one went on for half a century and was eventually broken by the Native Americans. That's a whole other story. But back at the first Thanksgiving, there was an event. They had a successful harvest. They invited Massasoit and his family, kind of having no idea that he would actually show up with roughly 90 warriors and however many wives and children there were. It went on for 3 days. It's pretty extraordinary. It was totally peaceful. and it is historically accurate to say that that event occurred. Now, it was not called the first Thanksgiving. That's something that has been laid upon that event in later times. I think most people know it was Lincoln in the 1800s. However, it was a very positive example of how two totally different cultures, can actually coexist, cohabit in friendship and freedom. And that's what we're talking about with our film project.
Okay, now you say the natives broke the treaty. How did that happen and why?
Well, excuse me. We'd rather just stick right now with the first Thanksgiving, and what we feel is that celebration that happened there was actually a continuation of a way of being and way of seeing that was started with the Mayflower Compact that was signed on November 11th, 1620, by the Mayflower Pilgrims, that had to do with bringing self-determination and consent of the governed. See, this whole Pilgrim thing wasn't just a religious thing. It was a seeking of a form of government, a form of society that they saw would be more in alignment with the true human nature of sovereignty. Okay, so this is what these pilgrims came into this to America with, and they met these Indians, Massasoit, who was a great leader of these of the Wampanoag, in particular the Pokanoket. See, the Indians were practicing participatory democracy before the Pilgrims came here, so they were both in alignment with a higher form of being, actually. And they met and they formed a peace treaty that lasted 50 years. They had this celebration that's come down through the centuries as something extraordinary. And our perspective is that, taking it from the bigger picture of everything, that this coming together of the Pilgrims and the Indians here in America actually started American democracy in the American mind and spirit.
All right, can you talk more about that, about they inspiring democracy, and also understand you consider the separation of church and state as being part of the native tradition here too?
Yeah, I'm not sure you could say separation of church and, because the native people did not separate. They didn't separate the spiritual from the secular. They lived an integrated life that was totally, I think, sort of, you might say, one with nature. Whereas Europe, ever since the founding of the Catholic Church, had steadily separated humanity from its roots, and the whole connection with spirit had co-opted by the church and by the priests and by the bishops, etc. This is what the Mayflower Pilgrims, also known as the separatists, were protesting about. That's where the word Protestant comes from. They wanted to return to what they saw as the original mission of Christianity, which was a direct relationship with the divine, which the native people were practicing, had been practicing forever. And in order to do that, you couldn't have the king being the head of the church and telling you how to worship and what to think and so on and so on. So they came, and it was illegal. It was, in fact, treasonous. You could be imprisoned. You could even be executed for practicing anything different from the religion as determined by the Church of England and headed by the monarch of England, Queen Elizabeth, followed by King James. So there was it was the beginning of an incredible movement that started with Luther about a century before in Europe, had spread to England. Henry VIII, of course, had famously broken away from the Pope because he wanted to get divorced, and you couldn't have a divorce under the Catholic Church, so he just reinvented the Catholic Church, called it the Church of England, put himself in the place of the Pope, and had as many divorces as he wanted. That's a whole other story, but that's actually the roots of this entire unfoldment. Fast forward to 1620, here comes a small group of remarkably dedicated humans who went through hell. It's a long and crazy story. We can't go into that. But what they went through to escape from England, to get to Holland, to get across the Atlantic on that little boat through storms, took them 66 days crossing the Atlantic. When they arrived in Plymouth, they arrived way too late. It was late November. They didn't come ashore until December 16th. Ridiculous time to set up your operation in England. In New England. Just insane. And it was a mini ice age. It was an exceptionally cold winter. They lost half of their members that first winter. In the spring, they met the Indians. They didn't meet any Indians all winter long. And in the spring, they met the Indians, crafted this treaty with the Indians, and it was kind of it was based on relatively democratic principles. There wasn't any big boss man. There wasn't any king or president or chief or leader telling people what to do. It was an agreement among human beings or Connie just said, a covenant. Good, that's a good word. It was a covenant. And these people, these two groups, honored that covenant for 54 years. Now, Victor, you asked a question. I'm not going to go there for long because we want to stick with with Thanksgiving. But 54 years later, the treaty was broken by the Indians with the outbreak of King Philip's War. Many people don't realize that King Philip was actually a Native American. He was the younger son of Massasoit, and it was the bloodiest conflict on this soil. It was a very unfortunate way that the Plymouth experiment came to an end. Truly sad. However, if you go back earlier in the history, you will find nothing between the Mayflower Pilgrims and the Indians that anybody could complain about. The fact is they really got on. And that first Thanksgiving event is an amazing 3-day festivity example of that.
Now, how long were the Pilgrims in the country before this date, before that Thanksgiving?
All right, that's easily answered. They arrived November 11th at Cape Cod. They chose present-day Plymouth, which was called Patuxet in those days. It was the home of the Patuxet tribe of people, or band of Native American indigenous people, who had perished. There were none of them left. They had died in an epidemic in between 1616 and 1618. And so they found themselves in a place that did not have inhabitants. The nearest inhabitants were about 46 miles away. They were the Pokanokets. And this was the end of 1620, December 1620. The date we're talking about is sometime probably in September of 1621. So it was a very short time. It was less than a year. It was time enough to plant and have a successful harvest, and it was the very, very beginning of this entire experiment. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Now, what about the language barrier? I mean, did the natives learn English? Did the English learn the native tongue?
Well, interestingly enough, and if you want to look at this from a higher perspective, the amazing thing was that Squanto had been taken and sold as a slave. He wasn't actually sold as a slave. He was taken by some friars in Spain. But earlier, Hunt had taken Squanto to England for actually the second time, or even the third time, and Squanto was a Patuxet, and he had spent all this time in England and had been returned to his people, to New England, by John Smith. And anyway, Andrew knows this better.
Yeah, Victor, what's really amazing is that the Mayflower arrives. They don't meet any Indians all winter long, but in the spring they meet some Indians, and one of them, and it's a long story, I can only really, summarize it, they meet a guy named Tisquantum, come down to us in history as Squanto. A lot of people heard of Squanto. Squanto spoke relatively fluent English. He had gone to England, we don't know the circumstances, but he had gone to England in probably something like 1609. He lived in the home of a man named Sir Ferdinando Gorges. He was returned by John Smith. Most New Englanders at least have heard of Captain John Smith. Was returned in 1614 to Patuxet, present-day Plymouth, and was then kidnapped by John Smith. Left and went down to Jamestown, leaving his other ship headed by a Captain Hunt, leaving Hunt to load up with beaver furs, beaver pelts, and fish, and return to England. Hunt did not do that. He used Squanto, apparently, to trick a bunch of native young men to get them on board his ship, slammed the hatches, and set sail for Spain, which is a whole crazy story. But what's really amazing is that Squanto, as a result of that, he didn't make it back to New England until 1619, when this huge war that had occurred and this huge epidemic that had happened at the same time had wiped out 100% of his people, or very close to 100% of his people. But here's Squanto speaking fluent English. So when they sat down to craft this treaty, they could communicate. The English, of course, could not speak a word of Pokanoket or Wampanoag, whatever they call their language, and likewise the Indians could not speak a word of English, with the exception of Squanto. That's what happened.
All right, let's talk about the difference, perhaps, in spirituality with the religious Pilgrims and what are often called heathen Indians.
Well,
What do we know about their beliefs, whether it's cosmological or in a god and such like that?
Well, interestingly enough, Victor, what we're bringing to the table is the spiritual alignment of the Mayflower Pilgrims and the Indians. And this is written by Edward Winslow in his Good News from New England. He relates a story after, very few people know that the Pilgrims actually saved the life of Massasoit. He was deathly ill, and the Indians had sent a word to the Pilgrims that their friend was dying, and the Pilgrim, Edward Winslow, went to Massasoit and fed him a conserve, herbal remedy, and he recovered. And meanwhile, while they were there in Pokanoket country, they stayed with one of the other chiefs, and at dinner they were, thanking God for the food and all this stuff, and the English were thanking, doing their praising God for their food and all that, and the other chief said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, we're thanking, our God for all this wonderful food." And the Indian chief said, "What you call God, we call Khitan. We believe the same things that you do. We just call it by a different name." And so that's actual historical sort of documentation of this alignment. And what I understand from my perspective is that, and our trust frequency perspective is that the Pilgrims lived a providence-based life. They totally were receiving information, they believed, from God, from a higher power, and they put their lives on the line to act according to these directions of what was being revealed to them and what would be revealed to them, because they knew that they didn't know everything. And the Native Americans, I've spent 30 years with visionary Native Americans, and I've come to understand the Native paradigm. It's a creator-based paradigm, a trust-based paradigm. So they both are operating from this paradigm of receiving information directly from a higher power. And that is what led them to stay in this relationship for so long. While Massasoit and Governor Bradford were alive, these two visionary leaders who saw this higher way of being and resonated to it and kept their people in this state of peace and friendship for their lifetime. After that, things started falling apart. The younger generation didn't have this vision to go by, and the materialism and all that stuff started taking hold, and things started falling apart.
Yeah, you anticipated my question, and that was like, where did it all go wrong, and at what point, and why?
Well, somebody expressed it very well, saying it was bit by bit. It started falling apart. This experience, and more people came, and more animals, cows. Cows were going into native lands, and pigs, and it was circumstances of life, of living, and at this lower level where materialism started to take hold and become a dominant factor. Whereas with the original Pilgrims, the higher aspects of being, of the equal and just laws for the common good and brotherhood and supporting each other and being together in community prevailed. But as these Pilgrims had like 10 and 11 children. I'm a Mayflower descendant. John and Priscilla Alden had 11 kids. So the pressures and all that, and the need for land. But one thing, people think that the land was stolen from the Indians, and there was a very strict rules and laws about the transfer of land. So, and the land was definitely paid for and was done in agreements, and so that's all a myth that the land was stolen, because it was a very like I said, strict laws as to how and who transferred land to whom.
But I always understood that the natives didn't believe in ownership of land.
Yeah, that doesn't seem to be true, in the sense that the native leaders clearly felt that they had the right, as the owners of the land, to transfer that ownership. But that's a whole complex story. There's a huge book written by a scholar named Jeremy Bangs called Indian Deeds that really goes deeply into that, and actually all of the documents at the time are presented in that book and analyzed. However, I think it's true to say that the natives did not have anything like the same concept of ownership of land. It seems that they didn't really understand that in the long run they were not going to be able to hunt and fish, for example, on that land, although those factors were written into the deeds. If you go back to the deeds, you will see that they retained the rights to hunt and fish on the land. They did not have the right to farm or to live on the land.
Oh, interesting.
The native people were exceedingly intelligent. They didn't just get the wool pulled over their eyes by the English when the English came in. They were very intelligent, and it was always negotiated. And today it sounds ridiculous that you bought 1,000 acres of land for 27 hatchets and a pile of blankets and the various things that the Indians required and desired. But the fact is that those were the things that had major value for them at the time, and recognize the fact that about somewhere between 75 and 90% of the population had disappeared in the late 1600s under as an effect of a war called the Tarleton's War and a horrific epidemic that was long believed to be smallpox and is almost certainly not smallpox. And that's a very tricky situation there to understand exactly what that was 400 years later. The fact is that land was abundant. The native people, one thing they had in outrageous abundance was land. What they didn't have was European technology. And one thing they really, really wanted was guns, because that made it a whole lot easier to hunt. It made defense against neighboring tribes a whole lot easier. And the thing they wanted most of all was actually European weaponry.
Okay, I want to remind you that you're listening to Expanding Awareness, and this is Victor Robert Venckus, and with us online is Andrew Cameron Bailey and Connie Baxter Marlow, and they are authors and filmmakers, and their book is called Trust Frequency, 10 Assumptions for a New Paradigm, and a film called In Search of the Future. Now, tell us about your film projects, including the first 50 years, Freedom and Friendship at Plymouth Plantation.
All right. So you mentioned a film that we made called In Search of the Future. What do the wise ones know? And Connie and I got together in 2003, and starting 2004, in the Kalahari Desert in Africa with the Bushmen, the world's oldest people, we went, one way I put it is we sort of went in search of the wisdom of humanity as it might have been retained by indigenous people the world over. We went and tracked down the wise elders of something like 14 different indigenous cultures. Now, in many cases, we had developed long-term relations with these folks. I had been working with the Kalahari Bushmen. Connie had been working with a lot of native elders over here in the United States. And so we had a real jump on, we weren't just walking into a village and saying, hey, we're here to make a film. These people knew us. They respected us. We'd developed trust with them. And so they said things that they would no way say to just some strange documentary filmmaker showing up in town. So that's a lovely film. It's called In Search of the Future. You can Google it and find it, and it still holds up. We released it in 2007, and it still looks and sounds good today. It's still relevant. Then our current project is called The First 50 Years, Freedom and Friendship at Plymouth Plantation. And a lot of people, their eyebrows go up. Freedom and friendship at Plymouth Plantation? What are you talking about? There are so many extraordinary misbeliefs about the Mayflower, about the Mayflower Pilgrims, and about that time period. So part of what this project, and it's a challenging project, part of what it sets out to do is to find the alignment between the natives and the English and to really shine a light on that precious gem of, it's really the origin story, one of the most important origin stories of the United States, what became the United States of America. There's a gem that has been essentially contaminated by truly negative misinformation. And then another part of the film, from my perspective, is to essentially set the historical record straight. About last Thanksgiving, just to go back to the Thanksgiving of 2013, the actress Cher tweeted. She put out a tweet that went out to 2 million people. It said, I do not celebrate Thanksgiving because the Mayflower brought smallpox-infected blankets. That is insanely incorrect, but about somewhere between 50 and 75% of Americans appear to believe that. Now think about that one just as the most outrageous example of a misbelief. The Mayflower arrived at the end of 1620. The epidemic was an epidemic. The epidemic occurred between 1616 and 1618. How on earth could the Mayflower have arrived with a load of smallpox-infected blankets 4 years after an epidemic and caused the epidemic? Makes no sense. When people hear the dates, they go, oh, they just go, whoa, I never thought about it like that. Secondly, how on earth could they have done that? There has never been, 143 years later during the French and Indian Wars, it was discussed. There were actually written letters where Amherst, of Amherst, Massachusetts fame, Amherst, I think he was a governor, was investigating the possibility of using this early form of biological warfare. There's no evidence it was ever actually done. And then in the 1800s out west, out in the plains, there may well have been, I simply don't know enough about that. I'm not studying that particular history. But as far as the Mayflower, smallpox blankets, and secondly, it wasn't smallpox. So there are just, Victor, there are these absurdities that people believe because they hear it, somebody tells them, and they simply believe it because they never actually check it out. And they, is this true?
And if it were true, how do they keep themselves from not being infected?
Exactly. And there's no evidence ever of smallpox in Plymouth Plantation. There's no evidence of smallpox on the Mayflower, which would have wiped out the people on the ship. It just is, it's an absurdity that has been spread as a form of disinformation or whatever you want to call it, because from my perspective, the Mayflower Pilgrims have been horrifically dishonored by a series. This is just one example of many, many ways that the Pilgrims are accused of doing things they simply did not do. So that's a part of this.
Yeah, one thing I heard, that they escaped, the Pilgrims escaped their homeland because of religious persecution, and that once they arrived, they they persecuted the natives and others. Any truth to that idea?
Well, one thing, Victor, that's confusing the Puritans with the Pilgrims, okay? The Puritans had a very much more stricter perspective and everything. The Mayflower Pilgrims were completely different from the Puritans. They had been Puritans, but they were Puritans who said, hey, we can't purify the Church of England. We must separate from it. Okay, and that was treasonous. When they held their secret meetings to worship in their own way, which was very similar to the native way of the direct communication, not through the church, not through the priests, not through all the claptrap. This was treasonous. And that's what this religious persecution is all about. King James was an absolute monarch, was against the law not to go to the Church of England, was against the law to gather and do your own thing. So this is the beginning of this separation of church and state. And they came together and formed a covenant, what's called the Scrooby Covenant of 1606, where they said, okay, we're going to pledge to each other and to God that we're going to walk as closely in alignment with our instructions from God, whatever it will cost us. And ultimately, it cost them their lives, many of them. And when they arrived on this land, I just want to make the point that they died of scurvy and sickness. They didn't die of starvation. They had plenty of food. They didn't die of smallpox. They didn't die of plague. They died of the rigors of having crossed the land crossed the ocean for 66 days. And arriving in the middle of winter and having to wade through the water. I mean, this is an astounding story, and one that we can all take inspiration from. And what I wanted to, what was his question?
His question was, how did they end up persecuting the Indians?
Well, I'm answering the question that they didn't persecute the Indians. They actually had juries in which they had the Indians on the juries. They were very open to the Indian and as equals, okay? And this treaty that they formed, they came together as equals. It was extraordinary, Victor. In the light of what had gone on before and what went on afterwards, this little gem of a time that is actually the founding story of America is something of this coming together of the Pilgrim and the Indian. See, that's what the story has been out of balance forever, because it left out the Indian. That's the big problem right here. We've left the Indian out of our consciousness, out of our story, our origin story, out of everything that they've contributed to the evolution of humanity and have yet to contribute. See, this is my whole mission and vision in this life is to bring the Indian to the table as an equal, bring what they know to the table. We're going beyond victim, perpetrator, beyond all the guilt and all the shame and all the blame and all that stuff. Come to the table together as equals and bring our understandings, what's come from the scientific paradigm, from this Western mind, and bring what these Indians know, what the indigenous peoples of the world know about our connection to what we call a conscious, loving universe. This is why humanity's out of balance. We don't get it. And it's because we're fractured. We haven't come together to the table as equals and listened to each other's hearts and spirits and created a world that understands what the native knows, and that is that we are interconnected in a conscious, loving, abundant universe.
Now, as the natives were, let's say, pretty evolved spiritually, had visions and such, how, once again, I want to come back to the idea of where things went wrong or how, if they had the vision of prophecy and such, could they not escape their fate, if you want to call it a fate?
Well, Victor, one thing, in the Indian cosmology, everyone knows there is a purpose to everything. Okay? Absolutely everything has a purpose. The native people, by the time the Pilgrims got here, the native people were warring with each other. They were doing horrific things to each other. This idea of the noble savage, this peace-loving people that were sitting here in ultimate peace and friendship is a myth that has to go, okay? What we have to understand is that the human race, all of the human race has a shadow, that all of the human race has been doing really crummy things to their own people, to others, and what we need to do, the white man's shadow is in his face with revisionist history, with Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky and all those guys have put that in our face. And that's now in our school systems, and actually Howard Zinn totally misrepresented the Mayflower Pilgrims. This revisionist history has gone to such an extreme of putting the white shadow in our face that it's actually brought misinformation to the table, which is what we're correcting. But meanwhile, what has to come to the table is the shadow of the Native Americans, okay? And their higher spirit. You see, but it's so out of balance because this white guilt of what we did to the poor, peace-loving Indians is just got to go, because what they were doing to each other, Andrew has done extremely amount of research on what was going on before the landing of the Mayflower, and it was not a pretty picture, okay? And what happened in Jamestown in 1622 with the Indians and slaughtering the people in Jamestown, you know, I mean, it's just an out of balance situation with this noble savage thing that we've got going, and we just need to know that all of the human race was doing stuff to each other. It has nothing to do with skin color. We have high, inspired, visionary people in all races, and we have low aspects of all races. So once we get to that place and get over the victim, perpetrator, blame, shame game, we can come together in our hearts and go forward.
Now, I'm not aware of what Noam Chomsky has to say on the topic.
Yeah, I'm actually not either. I am aware of what Howard Zinn said in his People's History of the United States, and he did not do his homework, Victor. I read a lot of writers who don't get it right. I have to say that Nathaniel Philbrick, who wrote the bestseller simply called Mayflower, is very, very historically accurate. He's right on. He has a bit of an attitude. He has a bit of an anti-English attitude, a little chip on his shoulder, understandably, but he got it right. Zinn did not. And Zinn is perpetuating misbeliefs in a best-selling book, and this is part of the problem, is that this material, these ideas, have, you know, I think there are certain politicians out there who know very well that if you tell a lie more than 3 times and nobody counteracts it, it becomes the historical truth. That's what oral history is all about. You can say whatever you like. If nobody contradicts it, that's the truth. And then what do you do? That's where we stand.
Yeah, that was attributed to Hitler too, right? Tell a lie often enough.
Yeah.
Okay. And I've also heard about Thanksgiving that the whites, the Europeans, were giving thanks to God for victory over the natives.
Yeah, tell me about that one.
I don't know more than that. Just that's an idea that's floated out there.
That's an idea that's very much floated out there. I put out a thing on my Facebook about a year ago when we started this project, and a native friend of ours came up, and I just said a little thing, we're starting this project about freedom and friendship at Plymouth Plantation. And he gets back with a comment that says, oh, what about the 700 Indians they slaughtered? Like, excuse me. Firstly, there were 14 men, the survivors of that little pilgrim group there. There were 14 adult males. There were 4 adult women. There were 34 children. And they're supposed to have slaughtered 700 Indians and then sat down for a feast with the survivors? I don't get it. Now, there is an event much, much later in a different place involving different people. That's the trouble. People conflate one event with another. They totally confuse. They collapse them. They say, oh, Hitler did all that bad stuff, and, he's white. Mother Teresa's white, so therefore she's guilty of it. It's that absurd. The story that I think you're thinking of, Victor, has to do with the Pequot War in Connecticut that involved a completely different tribe, the Pequots, who had slaughtered a bunch of English. About 10 or 14 English people had died in different circumstances. And Massachusetts Bay Colony came down on them way hard, shockingly hard, as it turns out. And as many as perhaps 400 Pequots were massacred. And that sucks. That's horrific. That's in Mystic, Connecticut. I was just there 2 weekends ago. And the Mayflower Pilgrims had nothing to do with that. So how do you see what I'm saying? They just mix things up and take an event that happened somewhere else some other time. Oh, Columbus did this, therefore, Obama did it. It's insane.
Somebody was thankful to do
Yeah, and to have a Thanksgiving at the end of a thing like that, the Indians had Thanksgivings every time they had a successful battle. Everybody gives thanks in whatever way. You dance and you drum and you do whatever you do, or you give thanks to God, you get down on your knees. If you came back safely from a battle, sure, I don't see anything wrong with that, but that has nothing to do with the first Thanksgiving, okay?
Now, is your project film, the first 50 years, completed? Is it available?
Oh, no, Victor, by no means. We're actually well over a decade into the research, and the last 12 months has been really deep, intense research, going all the way back to first contact between Europeans and Native American people, as far back as one can penetrate into history, and looking at what happened in New England prior to the landing of the Mayflower. In order for this film to have authority, it has to be historically impeccable. And in order to do that, we need to know what happened before the Mayflower arrived. And it turns out there was a huge war that he talks about that's hugely significant, that people in Plymouth don't know anything about because it actually came from elsewhere and totally took them by surprise. It came from up north. It was between two tribes up north who were fighting over fur trading rights with the French. And some Massachusetts groups went up and helped out one of the groups and got involved. They paid dearly for that because, anyway, it's a long story, but this armada of canoes came down from the north, slaughtering native people starting in about 1615, ending in 1619, at exactly the same time as the epidemic. So I'm very interested in knowing how that epidemic, because it's now understood the epidemic came down from the north. So whatever it was, whether it was bubonic plague, whether it was measles, could have been influenza, could have been many different diseases, was not smallpox, came from the north in the middle of a war. Need to know that stuff to understand what had preceded the Mayflower.
Well, why is smallpox out of the question?
The writings of the time, the best writing you have was a settler who arrived a couple of years after Plymouth was founded. His name is Phineas Pratt, and he distinguished the smallpox. The first smallpox we know about in New England is 1633 in Boston, and writing about that said it was different from what he called the plague that had hit the Indians earlier. He called it the plague. Now, I don't know if that means it was bubonic plague, but it seems the symptoms don't seem to have been the same. Interesting thing about smallpox does not kill everybody in the way that certain other epidemics is like Ebola. Imagine Ebola hitting. Some disease just coming from wherever it comes from and spreading through however it spreads. A war is an ideal way to spread an epidemic. As today we have, Boeing 747s, an ideal way to get diseases out of Africa and into Texas. So, the 1633 Boston smallpox took out a lot of English people, took out a lot of Indian people, and left a lot of survivors. This is one of the things. It would tend to, what's the word when you end up just horribly mutilated by the disease? There's a word for that, Connie. Disfigured, right. It was a disfiguring disease. Many people would survive smallpox but be disfigured. There's no evidence of that, just for example. So it's not, I mean, people do not understand, it's actually the Center for Disease Control before this Ebola thing was in the midst of a major study on the subject. So maybe there will be new information coming out.
All right. Let's.
And to your question, is the film finished? No, it's barely begun, Victor. I've filmed about a dozen interviews, most of them with Native American elders. We actually started out west. We have a house out in Sedona, Arizona, and we did our first couple of interviews, one up in the Aspen Valley in Colorado, one down in Sedona, to find out what those Native people understood about the Pilgrim-Indian relationship. And then we stopped in Oklahoma with various scholars and slowly made our way to the East Coast.
And one person that we interviewed in Tulsa has written a very important book. They're called Bradford's Indian Book. She's a Cherokee PhD Americanist, she's called. Her name's Betty Booth Donahue, and she's showing the Native influence on the Mayflower Pilgrims and on American literature. She's taking William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation, and which is the first book of American literature. See, our whole point is that America came out of this synthesis of the Indian and the Pilgrim and the settlers. Okay, so Betty's book shows that this 50 years of friendship led to a serious melding of cultures. These people were friends. They were family. They interchanged 50 years. Your kids play together. Your women get together. Everybody is family basically, and exchanging recipes and experiences and ways of seeing. And she points out very specifically how this Native influence came into the American mind, American literature. And it's well known that the American mind by 1776 was completely different from the European mind that stayed over in Europe because of this interaction with the Native Americans. And this is the key thing to bring forth, not how did it fall apart, but what came out of that 50 years that we can build on now and go forward into something that doesn't exist today when everybody's fighting everybody else and everybody's looking at the differences, when we can be coming together and look at our common ground and take humanity to a higher level. This is America. That's our job, to take it to a higher level. The whole world is counting on us, and look at us. We're going down the tubes.
Yeah, true enough. All right, what is the origin or the initial prophecy of the white buffalo, and do you feel that that's been fulfilled?
Well, the whole prophecy of the white buffalo is a big deal and very specific. The white buffalo calf woman came and brought all kinds of ceremony to the Lakota people, and maybe you're speaking of the birth of the white buffalo, that this heralds a new time. And Chief Orville Looking Horse very much emphasizes that the birth of the white animals are heralding this new time of the coming together. And this is key, and this has been in the Native prophecy forever, that there would be 500 years of winter, that the white man would come and there would be 500 years of winter, and then a spring would come that would bring 1,000 years of peace. Okay, and this is in the Bible too, this 1,000 years of peace. So we're in a time of change. This whole 2012 thing happened, December 21st, 2012. Everyone's like, oh, well, nothing happened. Well, something big happened. and that is the transformation of consciousness. We move to another level of consciousness. People want to let go of those old stories of that victim-perpetrator thing because it's becoming more and more evident that we are one. Quantum science is proving it, and we're just feeling it. With the World Wide Web bringing us together worldwide, we're just feeling our humanity and our brotherhood and sisterhood and the mixture. Now, I was talking to a Native American woman, and I said, it's your people and my people. We've got to come together. And she said, Connie, there's no more your people and my people. My house is full of mixed people. We can't go there anymore. So yeah, her husband was white, her kids are mixed, she's got black, whatever. There's no more separation. We've just got to get over it and let it go and go forward.
Wait, do you folks have a website and collecting information, maybe via email from the public?
Yeah, we have a website, a blog site for the first 50 years. It's called First 50 Years, YEARS.US. And we also have a YouTube channel, which is YouTube/First50YRS. Okay? So you can find us with First50YRS or First50YEARS. And we also have the trustfrequency.net, and we have the in search of the future movie.com, and all of our work has to do with moving humanity into a higher frequency. And we believe that William Bradford and Massasoit were two visionary leaders who came together in that higher frequency. They lived in that frequency. The people stayed there, and for that 50-year period, something extraordinary happened. It's an example of what can happen if humanity comes together in a higher way of seeing and way of being, and that visionary leaders can do that.
Now, Connie, you spent time with many different indigenous, let's call them wise people. What do they have to say about upcoming climate change, if anything?
Well, my experience with what I call visionary elders, they came into my life. They're mostly past now, and it wasn't about climate change. Mm-hmm. What I got from my experience with these people was this universal truth that quantum science is now proving. Okay, that's what my experience was, and what we've brought in the film, In Search of the Future. These elders, they're bringing the information that humanity, we're star people. We come from the stars. Okay, we are extraordinary beings. We didn't come from apes. We came from the stars. Okay, it's this level of thinking. The climate change thing, to me, is simply an indicator that we need to change how we think. We need to change our whole frequency to a higher level. It's a wake-up call. All it is, everything is a wake-up call for humanity to call us into our hearts so that we stop this absurdity that we're doing on all fronts. Everything we're doing is a total absurdity, and we need, and it's an outgrowth of our what we call our erroneous assumptions about the nature of the universe. If we understood what the native people know, that we're all interconnected, that it's all abundant, we're all one, everything loves us, the animal that shows up in our path to teach us a lesson is there because we are loved by this conscious, loving universe. We would get over all this competition and all this war and all this ridiculousness. So,
now, if one were to dial up your YouTube address, let us know that again, and what do they find? What will we find on the YouTube address?
Okay, it's youtube.com/first50YRS, and it has a lot of elders speaking from their hearts about this coming together. Okay, because we've been at this for 30 years.